"He's not my father," she screamed, and every single engine went dead. 150 bikers, leather, steel, road dust, 20 years of grief, and not one of them moved. They just stared at this girl, this stranger, this 20-year-old running toward them like the pavement behind her was on fire. And the man following her, calm as a Sunday morning, straightening his cufflinks, he smiled at them like they were the problem. That smile. That was the moment Grant Maddox knew something was very, very wrong. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been riding with us for a while, you already know we don't waste your time. Hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's find out together just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The memorial ride was supposed to start at 9. Grant Maddox had checked his watch 4 times before that, not because he was nervous about the schedule, but because he always checked his watch when something was pulling at the back of his mind that he couldn't name yet. 20 years of leading the Asheville chapter of the Hells Angels had given him something between instinct and religion. When the air shifted, he felt it before he could explain it. The Blue Ridge Roadhouse parking lot was packed. 150 bikes lined up in formation, engines idling low, the rumble of them vibrating through the asphalt and up through the soles of every boot planted on the ground. September in Asheville was the kind of morning that made you understand why people stayed the mountains behind the tree line, the air carrying just the first edge of cool, without the cruelty of winter yet, the light coming in clear and honest. But Grant wasn't looking at the mountains. He was watching the lot, counting heads the way he always did before a ride. 40 years of habit. You knew your people, you knew when something was off, and you moved before the problem moved first. Aaron Vale's memorial ride had been on the chapter calendar for 3 weeks. 20 years since Aaron disappeared. 20 years since the man who rebuilt more engines and told more bad jokes and stayed late more nights than anyone else Grant had ever known just stopped existing. No body, no explanation that held up to scrutiny, no justice. Just a missing persons report that gathered dust in a county file and a black motorcycle sitting under a canvas tarp in a garage outside Black Mountain that nobody had the heart to touch. This ride was about memory, about honoring a man who deserved to be remembered by the people who actually knew him, not buried in paperwork and silence. Grant had given the 5-minute warning. Engines were warming. He had his helmet in one hand and was walking back toward his own bike when he heard the running. Not jogging, running. The kind that meant something. He turned. She came through the gap between 2 parked trucks at the edge of the lot, and the first thing Grant registered wasn't her face. It was her feet. No shoes. Sneakers, technically, but the left one was half off her foot, the lace gone, and she was running hard enough the rubber was slapping the pavement with every stride. Her jeans were dirty at the knees. Her jacket thin, cotton, wrong for the morning temperature, had a torn pocket hanging loose at the hip. Her hair was a wreck, long and blonde and loose, like she'd slept in it or hadn't slept at all. She was clutching something to her chest with both arms. Something flat. A photograph. Grant took 2 steps toward her before he even made the conscious decision to move. She saw the bikes first. The mass of them, the leather, the size of the crowd. And for a half second, she faltered, that automatic human hesitation when you've run towards something and suddenly your legs aren't sure they made the right call. Then she looked past the bikes and she looked at the men. And whatever she was reading in their faces must have been better than what she was running from, because she kept coming. Hey, Grant started. That was when the SUV pulled in. Gray, new. One of those vehicles that announced money without announcing itself. Understated chrome, tinted windows, the kind of detail work that said the owner paid other people to care about things like that. It stopped at the edge of the lot with a quiet precision that felt rehearsed. The man who got out was somewhere in his mid-50s. Gray at the temples, suit jacket over an open-collar shirt, the build of someone who had been athletic 30 years ago and maintained enough of it to still feel entitled to the posture. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't alarmed. He walked toward the girl with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had done this before. and found patience more effective than speed. Haley, his voice was even, carrying. The kind of voice trained to fill rooms without raising. Come on, sweetheart. Let's not do this here. Grant stopped moving, watched. The girl Haley wheeled around at the sound of his voice. And the transformation in her face was not the kind you could perform or manufacture or fake. That was the look of genuine bone-deep fear. The kind that lives in your chest for years before it gets a name. She backed up until she was between two of the parked bikes. The men nearest her instinctively creating space without being asked, reading something in her posture that said, "Don't crowd her." "He's not my father," she said. She wasn't screaming yet. Her voice was cracking at the edges, raw from what sounded like hours of use. But she wasn't screaming. She was making a statement. Deliberate. Like she'd rehearsed it. Like she'd been building to it. "He is not my father," she said again. "And he's been lying to me my entire life." The sound that followed was the absence of sound. 150 throttles, all the way down. Someone near the back had been revving gently and didn't get the message fast enough. And for 2 seconds, there was just that one engine, and then that stopped too. The quiet came in like something physical. Calvin Rusk, because that was the name Grant would get within the next 10 minutes, spread his hands in a gesture of patient exasperation, not anger. That was important. A guilty man, Grant had always believed, went one of two directions when confronted, rage or retreat. But a practiced man went a third way. Reasonableness. Visible. Performative. Weaponized reasonableness. "These gentlemen don't need to be involved in our family situation," Calvin said, still using that measured voice, still talking to Haley like she was 6 years old and had gotten worked up over something that would resolve itself once the adults handled it. "She's been under a lot of stress since her mother passed. We're all grieving. I just want to take her home." Grant didn't say a word. He looked at Calvin. He looked at Haley. Haley was looking at Grant. There's a moment in any confrontation where you make a decision, and the decision you make defines everything after it. Grant had been in enough of those moments to recognize them. He could shut this down, tell the girl he was sorry for her trouble, tell the man to take it somewhere else, start his engines, and lead his people onto the highway. That was the clean choice, the uncomplicated choice. Instead, he walked toward Haley slowly. Not between her and Calvin, he planted himself to her side. Not in front of her, and he said, quietly enough that Calvin had to lean slightly to hear, "Nobody here is going to make you do anything. But if you want to tell me what's going on, I'm listening." Calvin's expression didn't crack, but something behind it did. Just barely, just for a second. Haley looked down at the photograph against her chest. Then she looked up at Grant. "I think," she said, "you might have known my father." She turned the photograph around. Grant had good eyes. He'd always had good eyes. He looked at the image, a young woman, blonde, holding an infant, standing next to a black motorcycle. And standing next to the woman, one arm around her shoulder, was a man Grant hadn't seen in 20 years, Aaron Vale. The sound Grant made was not a word. It was something more fundamental than that. 30 years of friendship, 20 years of absence, and Aaron Vale's face looking back at him from a photograph held by a girl with the same jaw, the same forehead, the same eyes that Aaron used to get when he was about to say something important. Grant's hands weren't quite steady when he took the photograph. He'd like to have blamed it on the cold, but it was September and it wasn't that cold. He looked up at Haley. Then he looked at her neck. She was wearing a silver compass on a chain. Small. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking, unless you knew what you were looking for. And Grant knew what he was looking for because Aaron Vale had worn that same compass every single day for the 11 years Grant had known him before he disappeared. And Aaron had explained once, when Grant asked him about it, that it had been a gift from someone he loved, and that the engraving on the back meant that no matter how far he went, he knew the direction home. Grant reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull back and turn the compass over. The engraving read, "No road is too long when someone is waiting." Grant had to breathe for a moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My mother left it for me," Haley said, "with the photograph, with the letters." I found them when I was going through her things after she died. What was your mother's name? Rebecca. Rebecca Monroe. The name went through the crowd like a current. Grant heard it move the men nearest him, catching it, passing it back, a murmur that built and settled. The older members, the ones who'd been there 20 years ago, they knew Rebecca Monroe. Aaron had talked about her, had loved her with the specific, helpless intensity of a man who had found something rare and knew it. Calvin Rusk took a step forward. This is unnecessary. She's been feeding herself a fantasy since her mother died, and the grief has been difficult, sir. Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I will ask you respectfully to give her a minute. Something passed through Calvin's eyes. He evaluated the size of the crowd. He evaluated Grant. He made the calculation. He stepped back. Grant turned back to Haley. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. Haley Monroe had grown up in Raleigh, in a house that Calvin Rusk owned outright, in a life that Calvin Rusk controlled with such complete and practiced authority that she had never understood the walls around her because she had never known anything different. That was the thing about being raised by a lie. The lie didn't announce itself. It was just the air you breathed. Calvin was her father. That was what she had always been told. That was what her childhood looked like: his house, his rules, his explanations for everything that didn't quite add up. When she was 7 and found a box of old photographs in the back of the hall closet and pointed to a man she didn't recognize and asked who that was, Calvin had taken the box without answering, and she never saw it again. When she was 12 and asked her mother, Rebecca, about her biological father, the question had come from a school assignment, family trees, something innocent and routine. Rebecca had started to answer. She'd opened her mouth, and her eyes had gone somewhere complicated, and she'd said, Haley, there's something I should. And then Calvin had walked into the room. And Rebecca had gone quiet, a specific kind of quiet, the kind that meant a decision had been made that Haley was too young to understand yet. Your father is right here, Calvin had said. And he'd put his hand on Rebecca's shoulder, and the way he touched her was the way you touch something that belongs to you. Not affection, possession. Haley hadn't asked again, not because she stopped wondering, but because she was a child, and she was smart, and smart children learn to read which questions are safe. Rebecca Monroe had been sick for the last 4 years of her life. Slowly and then quickly, the way serious illness tends to move, grinding for a long time, and then decisive at the end. Calvin had been present through all of it, attentive, even, organized the doctors, managed the medications, made sure the bills were paid and the appointments were kept. On paper, he was a devoted companion. On paper, he was everything a man in his position was supposed to be. But Haley had watched her mother's eyes during those years, and she had noticed that when Calvin was in the room, Rebecca was careful, measured. She said the right things. She laughed at the right moments. She thanked him for the right gestures. And it was only in the private moments, when it was just the two of them, Haley sitting on the edge of Rebecca's bed while the afternoon light came through the curtains, that her mother became someone else, someone freer, sadder, someone who sometimes reached for Haley's hand and held it without saying anything for a long time, like she was trying to communicate something through touch that she couldn't find the language for. 3 weeks before Rebecca died, she had a good day. The kind that feels like a gift and a farewell at the same time. Haley had driven over from her apartment. She was 19 by then, working part-time, taking classes, and they had talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, about what Haley wanted her life to look like, about the kind of woman Rebecca had wanted to be when she was young. And then Rebecca had said, very carefully, like she was testing the weight of each word before she set it down, when I'm gone, there are things in my room, in the false bottom of the wooden jewelry box. I need you to find them before anyone else does, especially Calvin. Haley had gone very still. Mom, I need you to promise me. What kind of things? Rebecca had looked at the door. Habit. Years of habit. The kind that will answer questions you gave up asking. Calvin Rusk arrived 15 minutes later, having apparently decided to stop by on his way from a lunch meeting. The conversation ended. It never resumed. Rebecca Monroe died 11 days after that, and she died in that specific private way that meant Haley was not there when it happened. Calvin had called her to say her mother was resting. The doctor said she was stable. Come in the morning. Haley did not make it in the morning. Calvin handled the arrangements. Calvin handled the paperwork. Calvin managed the house, the estate, the details. He was very competent. He was very present. He kept Haley close without letting her alone for long enough to do anything unsupervised. But grief has its own schedule, and eventually the house had to be packed. Calvin had stepped out for an hour, a call, a meeting, something that required his physical absence and his particular brand of controlled attention, and Haley had gone to her mother's room. The jewelry box was mahogany. She'd known it her whole life. It sat on the dresser and played a small tune when you opened it, and it had held Rebecca's earrings and a few necklaces and a charm bracelet that Haley had given her for Christmas when she was 9. She pressed her thumbs to the felt lining at the bottom, and she pushed. The false bottom was shallow, maybe an inch of depth. But there are things that take up no physical space and weigh everything. She found the birth certificate first. It was the original. Not the amended one, the original filed 20 years ago in a Buncombe County hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. Haley Louise Monroe, born September 14th. Mother, Rebecca Ann Monroe. Father, Aaron David Vale. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down and picked up the letters. There were 7 of them, handwritten. The penmanship was careful, not pretty, not the cursive of someone who'd been trained to it, but deliberate. The handwriting of someone who chose each word and meant it. They were addressed to Rebecca, and the return address in the upper left corner of the earliest ones was an Asheville garage. She read them in order. The first 3 were love letters. Essentially, though, they weren't sentimental in any greeting card way. They were specific and real. Aaron writing to Rebecca about ordinary things. About a carburetor he'd rebuilt, about a song he'd heard on the radio that made him think of her, about the way he planned to fix up the spare room before the baby came. The baby. Haley. He wrote about Haley with the particular tenderness of someone who had not yet met her and was already certain she mattered. The 4th letter was different. The tone shifted. Aaron's handwriting was the same, but there was tension in it. You could feel it in the pressed letters, the places where the pen had pushed harder. He had found something, he wrote, in his work. Something he hadn't been looking for and had wished, for a moment, that he hadn't found. Calvin Rusk was a client of the shop, not a big client. The kind who came in irregularly, paid cash, didn't ask for paperwork. Aaron had thought nothing of it at first. Cash customers existed. But over several months, he'd started to notice things. The motorcycles Calvin brought in for title transfers, there were inconsistencies. Numbers that didn't quite match the registration paperwork. Gaps in the ownership chains. And then a mechanic Aaron trusted had pulled him aside and said he recognized one of the bikes. He'd known its original owner. That owner had reported it stolen 18 months earlier. Aaron had started keeping records. By the 5th letter, he had enough to see the shape of the operation. Calvin ran a network. Stolen bikes, mostly high-end, the kind with legitimate resale value. They were acquired through a distributed chain of intermediaries brought to shops like Aaron's for the kind of technical work that required someone who knew what they were doing. And then the identification numbers were altered, and new titles were generated through a document service Calvin controlled that had the appearance of a legitimate business. Aaron had photographs. He had ledgers. He had names. He intended to give everything to a federal contact he'd been developing. In the 6th letter, dated about 3 weeks before Aaron disappeared, the tone changed again. He had told Rebecca not to worry. He told her that the moment the handoff was done, he would come home and they would leave Asheville and start somewhere new. He had already found a place. He had already made a plan. But Calvin knew he was planning to talk. The last letter was 2 paragraphs. Rebecca, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong. Do not come looking for me. Do not let anyone know what you know. Keep her safe. Keep her hidden if you have to. When she is old enough to understand, when she is old enough to protect herself, Give her the compass and show her how to follow it north. The people at the garage will know what to do. I love you both. I have never stopped. Whatever comes next, know that I chose this because I believed it was the only way to keep you out of it. I was wrong about a lot of things, but not about that. Erin Haley had been standing in the parking lot of the Blue Ridge Roadhouse for 11 minutes by the time she finished telling them the outline of it. The sun had moved. Grant hadn't moved at all. The men around them were quiet. That large groups of men are quiet when something has settled into their collective chest and they haven't decided yet how to process it. Some of them had known Aaron Vale personally. Some of them had come of age hearing the name. All of them had come today to remember him. Grant had the birth certificate in his hand. He had the photograph. He had turned the compass over twice and put it back in Haley's hand both times, like he couldn't quite let himself hold on to it. He looked at Calvin Rusk. Calvin was standing 20 feet away, phone in hand, a model of patient irritation. He hadn't left, which told Grant something. A man with nothing to hide and a legitimate claim on this girl would have escalated, called the police, made demands, gotten loud. Calvin was watching, waiting, managing the situation, the way manage something you don't want to get out of control. She's been through a great deal, Calvin said when Grant looked at him. Her mother's death, the estate process. She found some old paperwork that she's misinterpreted, and she's latched onto a story that feels better than grief. It's not unusual. Anyone who's lost a parent. Can you tell me her birthday? Grant said. Calvin blinked. Excuse me? Haley. Her birthday. What is it? A pause. So brief it might have been invisible to someone not watching for it. September 14th, Calvin said. And the hospital? Another pause. Raleigh. Haley said quietly, I wasn't born in Raleigh. The birth certificate in Grant's hand was from Buncombe County, Asheville. Calvin would have known that if he'd been there. Grant looked at the man for a long moment. Then he turned and caught the eye of Naomi Pierce, who was standing near the back of the crowd with her helmet under her arm and her phone already in her hand. Naomi had been the chapter's attorney for 12 years. She was 53, meticulous, and had the specific quality of patience that came from spending decades, knowing exactly when the moment to act had arrived and not moving before it. He tilted his head toward Haley. Naomi moved. Calvin shifted his weight when he saw Naomi approaching. A small movement. The kind that doesn't mean anything on its own and means everything in context. I think, he said, I'd like to see the documentation you mentioned, Naomi said pleasantly. The legal documents establishing your relationship to Haley. Since you brought them up, I'm an attorney. I'd be happy to take a look and help sort out the confusion. I don't think that's necessary. I don't either. If you're right, it would take about 5 minutes and everyone goes home. A beat. Calvin looked at Grant. Grant watched him look. I don't have them on my person. They're in your car. Calvin went still. How would you? Because a man who drives 2 hours to retrieve his daughter from a motorcycle rally carries the paperwork that proves she's his daughter. Naomi's voice was perfectly reasonable, perfectly courteous. If you didn't bring them, that tells me something. If you brought them and you're choosing not to show them, that tells me something else. The calculation behind Calvin's eyes was almost visible. He was weighing outcomes, costs, and returns, the specific arithmetic of someone whose entire life hadn't been built on controlling information. He walked to the SUV. He came back with a folder. Naomi took it. She didn't open it standing there. She stepped back, turned slightly away, and worked through it methodically while Grant stood where he was, and Calvin stood where he was, and 150 bikers watched without any of them having to say a word about what they were doing. It took 4 minutes. Naomi, Mr. Rusk, she said, I'm curious about something. This conservatorship was filed in Raleigh 11 months ago while Haley's mother was still alive. But the medical evaluation supporting it is signed by a doctor, Philip Hart. She paused. Does Dr. Hart have any professional relationship with you? A consulting arrangement, perhaps, or that's irrelevant. It's on his letterhead. She held up the document. His practice address is listed as a suite on the 14th floor of a building that your company leases in its entirety. The quiet in the parking lot got deeper. Calvin straightened, and the thing that showed in his face then, just for a moment, just a flash before the control came back, was not anger. It was calculation, pure and cold and completely divorced from anything resembling paternal concern. She is emotionally fragile, he said. I have a legal obligation to what? Haley said. She hadn't spoken in several minutes. She'd been watching him, the way you watch something you've been afraid of for years and are finally, in this specific moment, slightly less afraid of. Not unafraid, slightly less afraid. There's a difference. To protect you, Calvin said. From what? From making decisions that aren't in your best. My mother's house, Haley said. Who owns it? Calvin didn't answer. When she died, it passed to me. Didn't it? That was in her will. But you filed for conservatorship before she died, which means you had financial control before the estate was settled, which means she stopped. Looked at Naomi. Naomi nodded slightly. Haley looked back at Calvin. How long have you been planning this? The man who had raised her, the man who had told her whole life, that he was her father, that her mother was confused, that Aaron Vale was nothing, nobody, a name that didn't matter, looked at her with an expression that had stopped pretending to be love. You have no idea, he said quietly, what your real father did, or what will happen if you keep digging. He walked back to the SUV. He got in. The window came down 2 inches and his voice came through it, still controlled, still measured. Think carefully. Haley, about who's protecting you, and about what you think you'll find. The SUV pulled out of the lot. Grant watched it go. Then he turned and looked at Naomi. He's not trying to get his daughter back, Grant said. No, Naomi agreed. He's trying to get something else. Naomi closed the folder. Aaron Vale found evidence of a criminal operation. He never handed it over. Calvin Rusk has had 20 years to wonder where it went. She looked at Haley. And then this girl shows up with Aaron's photograph and Aaron's compass, asking Aaron's old friends where to start looking. Haley had listened to all of this. She was standing very still in the way that people stand when they are processing more than their system was designed to handle in a single morning, and they are keeping themselves upright through the specific discipline of focusing on the next thing rather than the weight of everything. She said, my father mentioned a garage in the letters. He said something about when I was old enough to follow the compass north. He said the people at the garage would know what to do. Grant looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the 149 men standing in the lot behind him. Engines warm, nowhere they needed to be more urgently than here. I know the garage, he said. He put his helmet on. Stay close to me, he said. We're going to find out what he left you. The engines didn't start all at once. They started in sequence, a rolling thunder that moved through the lot from front to back, each bike adding its voice to the collective sound until the whole world was vibrating and the September was louder than it had any right to be. Haley Monroe stood in the middle of all of it, her hand around the silver compass her father had left for her before she was old enough to know his name. She pressed it flat against her chest. She followed Grant to the lead. The ride out of Asheville was not a memorial anymore. Nobody said that out loud. Nobody had to. The shift happened the way shifts in large groups always happen, not through announcement, but through alignment. One person reading another, 100 small adjustments of posture and purpose that added it up to something collective and decided. They had come this morning to remember a dead man. They were leaving to find out whether he had ever actually died at all. Grant kept his speed steady. Haley was in the sidecar of Denny Marsh's rig. Denny was 61, had ridden with the chapter for 28 years, and had arms like dock rope and the specific gentleness of very large men who had learned, somewhere along the way, that size was most useful when you didn't use it. He'd offered the sidecar without being asked. Haley had gotten in without hesitation. Grant had noticed both things and filed them away as information about character. Naomi was 3 bikes back, phone against her ear, talking to someone Grant couldn't hear over the engines. She had been on the phone since they left the lot. That was either good or bad, and Grant had decided not to try to determine which until he had more information. He kept his eyes on the road, and he let himself think about Aaron Vale. 20 years. The weight of it didn't hit you all at once. It had been distributed across 2 decades of ordinary days. Surfacing in small moments, a familiar wrench in the shop drawer, a joke someone started and stopped when they remembered who the punchline belonged to. Aaron had been the kind of man whose absence took up the same amount of space as his presence. Maybe more. Grant had been 35 when Aaron disappeared. He'd driven every road between Asheville and the Tennessee border himself the first week, not because he thought it would produce anything, but because he needed to do something with his hands and his time, and the particular helpless fury of a man who cannot locate the thing he's supposed to be protecting. They'd filed reports. They'd pushed. The investigation had lasted 6 months before it softened into occasional inquiries, and then into the particular bureaucratic silence that means nobody is looking anymore. He had never believed Aaron ran, not for a single day. Aaron Vale had a daughter he hadn't met yet, and a woman he loved, and a box full of evidence against a man who had every reason to want him gone. Running was not the math that added up. Grant had known, in the way you know things you can't prove, that Calvin Rusk was the answer to the question. He'd known it for 20 years. He'd had nothing to stand on. He glanced in his mirror at the line of bikes stretching back along the mountain road. Maybe now, he did. The old repair shop outside Black Mountain sat at the end of a county road that had been steadily losing its argument with the surrounding vegetation for 2 decades. The building itself was still standing sheet metal roof, concrete block walls, a roll-up door that had last been rolled up in the early months of the second Bush administration. Aaron had rented the space from a retired machinist named Gerald Pruitt, who had died in 2009 and whose estate had apparently never gotten around to doing anything with the property. It sat there, year after year, waiting for something or someone to come back to it. Grant had been out here twice since Aaron disappeared. Once in the first weeks, when the search was still active. Once on the 5-year anniversary, alone, on a cold November morning, because he needed somewhere to put the weight of it, and the road was the only place it had ever made sense to carry heavy things. He had never gone inside. He didn't know why, exactly. Or maybe he did and hadn't wanted to examine it too carefully. He pulled up to the roll-up door and killed his engine. The silence after a 150-bike stop is its own kind of sound. It settles around you like something solid. Haley was already out of the sidecar before Denny had cut his engine. She was standing with the photograph in one hand and the compass in the other, looking at the building with an expression that wasn't quite readable, not fear, not excitement, something in between that didn't have a clean word in English. "This is it," she said. "This is it," Grant said. He mentioned this place in the 4th letter. He said it was where he kept the work separate from the shop, the records he didn't want anyone to find before he was ready. She paused. "Do you have a key?" "No, but I know who does." He made a call. 12 minutes later, a woman in her early 70s arrived in a pickup truck that had seen better decades. Edna Pruitt, Gerald's daughter-in-law, who had inherited the property, along with approximately 40 years of accumulated machinery and the conviction that none of it should be touched until someone with a legitimate reason to touch it showed up. She looked at Grant. She looked at the 150 men arranged in a patient arc behind him. She looked at Haley. She looked at the compass around Haley's neck for a long time. "You're Aaron's girl," she said. It wasn't a question. Haley blinked. "You knew him?" Gerald did. Aaron paid 6 months ahead, every time. Said he didn't want to be worrying about rent when he was working. Gerald always said a man who pays 6 months ahead is either very responsible or very scared. She pulled a key from her jacket pocket. I think maybe Aaron was both. She handed the key to Haley, not to Grant, to Haley. "It's hers," Edna said simply. When Grant looked at her, "Whatever's in there." Haley took the key. Her hand was steady. Grant noticed that, too. The roll-up door groaned its objection to being disturbed, but eventually gave way. The smell that came out was 2 decades of settled dust and metal and old oil, familiar in the specific way that certain smells carry time inside them, years compressed into scent. The building was not large. A single open space with a workbench along one wall, a tool chest that had been pushed into the corner, a mounted vise overhead fluorescent lights that Naomi found the switch for and which buzzed but held. And in the center of the floor, under a canvas tarp that had gone from green to the approximate color of old newspaper, a shape that Grant recognized by its outline before the tarp came off. Aaron's motorcycle, a 1986 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, black, customized, over years of patient, careful work into something that was partly a machine and partly a document of the man who had built it. Every modification was Aaron the handlebar angle, the custom foot pegs, the hand-painted detail work that Aaron had done himself one winter when the weather was keeping everyone indoors. Grant could have identified it from twice the distance in half the light. Haley walked around it slowly, not touching it yet. She was reading it the way you read something written in a language you recognize but haven't spoken before. The photograph in her hand showed the same bike, younger, cleaner, but the same. The letters said something about following the compass north. She said more to herself than to anyone else. She stopped walking. She was looking at the fuel tank. He said to follow the compass. She reached out and touched the small stylized compass symbol painted on the side of the tank. Aaron's emblem, he'd used it on all his personal work. Then she moved her hand under the tank, feeling along the underside, and her fingers found something that her expression told Grant she hadn't quite expected to actually find. A mark, carved, not painted, a small arrow pointing toward the front of the bike. She followed it. The front of the bike, the headlight housing. She looked at it, then at Grant. He was a mechanic, Grant said quietly. He knew how to hide things inside machines. Denny had a socket set in his saddlebag. Of course he did. It took 4 minutes to remove the headlight housing, and inside, packed in wax paper that had kept the moisture out for 20 years, was a sealed metal tube about the length of a man's forearm. Haley took it. She looked at the room full of people watching her. Open it, Grant said. She did. Inside, photographs printed on photo paper, edges crisp despite the years. Ledger pages, handwritten, columns of numbers and dates, and what appeared to be vehicle identification numbers. A folded document that turned out, when Naomi took it carefully and opened it, to be a list of names dealers, intermediaries, document processors, all with addresses and phone numbers that were 20 years old, but that Naomi was already photographing with her phone. And at the bottom of the tube, coiled in wax paper separately, a cassette tape. The kind that required a player nobody carried anymore, in a plastic case with Aaron Vale's handwriting across the label. For Haley, when she's ready. The room was very quiet. Haley held the tape and didn't say anything for long enough that Grant started to worry about her. Then she looked up, and her jaw was set in the specific way that people's jaws get when they have decided to feel something later and function right now. I need a cassette player, she said. Naomi was already on her phone. I need everything on that tube photographed and digitally copied before it leaves this building, she said. To Grant rather than to Haley, which was the right instinct protecting the chain of evidence. I've already reached out to a contact at the state AG's office, and I've got a federal vehicle crimes unit number from a case 2 years ago. This goes digital before Calvin Rusk gets another hour to think about his options. Grant looked at Naomi. You think he'll come here? I think he already knows where here is, Naomi said. He's had 20 years to map this out. He knew where Aaron worked. He knew about this shop. He stayed close to Rebecca specifically because she was the thread that led to everything Aaron left behind. She looked at Haley. He didn't know about you, not as of a factor. He knew you existed, but he underestimated what you'd do when you found the box. He thought I'd be easier to manage, Haley said. He thought you'd be easier to manage, Naomi confirmed. Haley's expression was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was something colder than both. The specific temperature of a person recalibrating everything they understood about their own life. He was wrong, she said. She said it the way Aaron used to state things, Grant thought. Plain and final, and with no performance behind it. Just the fact of it dropped into the air. He was wrong. Grant looked at the door, then at Naomi, then at the 149 men standing outside, visible through the open roll-up. arranged in a loose perimeter that had formed without anyone directing it because 150 people who had spent decades reading situations had all read this one the same way. "Get everything copied," he said to Naomi. "Now, don't wait." She was already moving. That was when they heard the second set of engines, different from motorcycles. The flat, deliberate sound of heavy SUVs taking a county road faster than county. Roads were designed to be taken. Haley heard it. Her head came up. Grant said without moving, "Stay inside." She looked at him. "Is that Calvin?" "Probably." Grant was already walking toward the door. He didn't waste time. "Because he knows what's in that tube," she said. "Because he's known for 20 years that whatever Aaron hid was going to end him eventually." Grant stopped at the threshold. He's been waiting for this day. He just thought he'd be controlling it. 2 SUVs. The gray one from the parking lot, and a black one that had appeared from somewhere Calvin had been keeping it. They stopped at the edge of the property, where the county road gave way to the gravel approach, and Calvin Russ got out of the gray one, and 2 men got out of the black one, who had the specific build of men Calvin paid to handle physical situations. Calvin looked at the row of motorcycles. He looked at the men standing in front of the building. He did his calculation. Then he walked forward anyway. Grant had to give him that. The man had nerve. Whatever else he was not a coward. And there is something almost like respect that a certain kind of man extends to another certain kind of man who walks toward a problem of his own making without flinching. Almost like, not quite, Grant, Calvin said. He said it like they knew each other, like he was arriving at a mutual disagreement between reasonable men. "Mr. Rusk," Grant said, "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding this morning. I understand emotions are running high. It's a memorial event. I respect that, I do. But Haley is not well, and whatever she's told you." She showed me Aaron Vale's original birth certificate with her name on it. Calvin didn't blink. Documents can be obtained, manipulated. A young woman in grief, looking for something to hold on, and the compass, a pause, just a beat. "I don't know what you're talking about." Aaron's compass, the one he wore every day. Rebecca left it for Haley. A song with 7 letters in Aaron's handwriting, along with a cassette tape. Grant watched Calvin's face the entire time, along with about 20 pages of documentation that apparently outlines a vehicle identification fraud operation that's been running since at least the mid-90s. Something moved behind Calvin's eyes. The calculation got faster, more complex. "Those documents are 20 years old. Whatever Aaron believed he'd found. You're not asking me what's in them." Calvin stopped. "A man who's been lied about asks what the evidence shows," Grant said. "A man who knows what the evidence shows doesn't ask. He starts explaining why it doesn't count." He looked at Calvin for a long moment. "Aaron Vale was your mechanic. He found something he wasn't supposed to find. He built a file on you, and he planned to take it to federal authorities. And then he disappeared." He paused. "I've believed that for 20 years. Now I have something besides belief." Calvin's expression had gone neutral, in the way that faces go neutral when the person behind them has stopped performing and started surviving. The 2 men from the black SUV had moved up slightly. One of Grant's people moved correspondingly. Just positioning. Nobody touching anything yet. "Whatever you think you have," Calvin said, "you don't understand the context. I think Naomi already uploaded the photographs to the state attorney general's office." Grant checked his watch. "She started about 4 minutes ago. She works fast." He watched that land. It landed hard. Calvin looked at the building behind Grant. He looked at the men. He did the math one more time, different numbers this time. Different result. And Grant could see the moment the strategy shifted. The visible patience cracked, just along the edges, just enough to show what was underneath it, which was not warmth and never had been. "You have no idea what Aaron Vale did," Calvin said. And his voice had changed lower now, the performed reasonableness gone, something flatter and more honest underneath it. "You have no idea what he stirred up, or who he made enemies with. He wasn't just documenting me. He was documenting people I worked with who do not respond to this kind of interference with lawyers and courts." Grant held his eyes. "Is that a threat?" "It's information." I'm giving you information because I would rather everyone walk away from this morning intact. That's interesting, Naomi said. Grant hadn't heard her come up behind him. She was standing just to his right, phone in her hand, recording application, open and visible. Because from where I'm standing, Naomi continued, you just implied that there are parties beyond yourself who might harm people connected to this investigation, which is actually more useful to the federal case than anything in that tube. She looked at the phone. Thank you for that. Calvin went completely still. And then something happened that Grant did not expect. Haley walked out of the building. She had been told to stay inside. Grant turned to look at her, and she was already past him, the cassette tape in one hand, the metal tube in the other, walking toward Calvin Rusk with the specific measured pace of someone who has decided to stop letting other people stand between her and the things she needs to face. Calvin looked at her, and for just a moment, a single, unguarded moment, something passed through his face that was more complicated than calculation. Something older. Something that might have been the ghost of something he'd once tried to pass off as affection. Or the closest thing to remorse that a man like Calvin Rusk was capable of experiencing, which wasn't much, but it was visible. Haley, he started. Wire, she said, my mother. Why did you stay? If it was about the evidence, if it was about controlling what she knew, you could have, there were other ways to manage that. Why did you stay for 23 years? Calvin was quiet. Because she loved him, Haley said. Didn't she? She loved my father and she never stopped. And you wanted that. Not her, you wanted what she felt for him. And you knew you'd never get it. And you stayed anyway. She looked at him the way you look at something you finally understand and wish you didn't. That's why you hated him. It wasn't just the evidence. It was that she chose him. The silence was complete. Calvin said very quietly, you don't know what you're talking about. I know my mother's handwriting, Haley said. And I know what it looked like when she wrote his name, even at the end. 23 years, and she still wrote it the same way. She looked at the cassette in her hand. He left me a message. I haven't heard it yet. But I know what's in it, because I know who he was. From 7 letters written to a woman he loved. She met Calvin's eyes. You kept me close because I was connected to the evidence. But you also kept me close because I was all that was left of him. And that's the thing you can't file a motion about. She turned and walked back into the building. Calvin stood where he was. The 2 men from the black SUV hadn't moved. The 150 bikers hadn't moved. The county sheriff's vehicle turned onto the gravel approach. Grant had made that call from the road 20 minutes earlier to a deputy he'd known for 15 years. He watched the cruiser pull up. He watched Calvin's face complete its final calculation. The evidence was already digitized. The recording was in Naomi's phone. The sheriff was here. And the building behind Grant contained 150 witnesses and a woman who had just, in the space of 4 minutes, said everything that needed to be said. Calvin Rusk looked at Grant. This isn't finished, he said. No, Grant agreed. It's not. He said it without satisfaction because it was simply true. Whatever was in that tube, whatever was on that tape, whatever Naomi's contacts at the AG's office were going to do with what she'd sent them, that was the start of a process, not the end. Justice moves slowly when it moved through systems. Grant had learned that. It moved slowly, and it was not guaranteed, and it was imperfect. But it moved. Calvin got back in his SUV. The black vehicle followed. They left the way they came, down the county road, back toward whatever next move Calvin Rusk's mind was already assembling. The sheriff's deputy, a young man named Torres, who had the look of someone who had expected a quieter Tuesday, stood at the edge of the property and looked at the assembled crowd and the open building and Naomi Pierce walking toward him with a printed summary already in her hand. Ma'am, he said. I'll explain everything, Naomi said. I need you to understand that we have time-stamped digital copies of all evidence already filed with the state AG. Nothing here can be made to disappear. She handed him the summary. And I need you to pull whatever you have on a missing persons case from approximately 20 years ago. A man named Aaron David Vale reported missing from Asheville. Buncombe County filed it. It may have been transferred. Torres looked at the paper. looked up at Grant, looked at the crowd. How long has this been going on, he asked. 20 years, Grant said, give or take a morning. Inside the building, Denny Marsh had produced, from somewhere that Grant chose not to examine too carefully, a portable cassette player, the kind the truck drivers used to use. He'd handed it to Haley without comment. She was sitting on the workbench when Grant came back inside. The player was in front of her. The cassette was not yet in it. She was holding the compass, turning it over in her fingers. Are you ready? Grant asked. She looked at the player for a moment, then at the tube, then at the photographs she'd been carrying since she left her mother's house 2 days ago. In the dark, through a kitchen window, with nothing but the things she'd found in the bottom of a jewelry box and a name in a letter and the direction north. I don't know what ready means, she said, but I'm going to do it anyway. She put the cassette in the player. She pressed play. The tape hissed for a moment, the specific analog warmth of sound recorded on magnetic ribbon 2 decades ago. Slightly worn, slightly trembling at the edges, but there, present, intact. And then a voice came through the small speaker. Aaron Vale had a voice that was lower than you expected from his build. He'd been lean, medium height, the kind of man who took up less space than he deserved, and it carried a quality that Grant recognized immediately, the quality he'd forgotten until this moment, and which came back to him now with the specific force of something long buried and suddenly exposed. Aaron sounded like a man who was frightened and had decided not to let the fear make his decisions. The room had gone absolutely still. All of them, Grant, Naomi, Denny, the 20 men who had come inside, the others visible through the open door, all of them listening to a dead man's voice explain what he'd found, what he'd tried to do, who had threatened to use the people he loved against him, and why he had made the choice he made, and then the final words. Haley, if you're hearing this, you followed the compass. I always believed you would. I don't know how old you are. I don't know what your life has looked like. I hope it's been good. I hope it's been better than I had any right to expect, given what I couldn't give you. I need you to know something, and I need you to believe it, even if nobody has ever told it to you before. I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I believed, in that specific moment, that distance was the only shield I could give you. I was 29 years old, and I was wrong about a lot of things. But I was not wrong about that. Whatever comes next, whatever this recording leads to, whatever you find, whatever has to be faced, you don't have to do it alone. I left you a compass. I left you people I trusted. I left you the truth. The rest is yours. I love you. I have never stopped, not for a single day, Aaron. The tape ran to silence. Haley sat with both hands flat on the workbench, the compass pressed under one palm. She didn't cry. She breathed, long and measured and deliberate, the way people breathe when the alternative is falling apart in a room full of strangers who have already given them more than they had any right to ask for. Grant didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the tape hadn't already said better. He sat down on the other end of the workbench and he waited. Because that was what you did for people who needed a minute. You didn't fill the silence. You held it with them. After a while, Haley said, "He's not dead." Grant looked at her. Something in the letters. He said, Calvin wanted him out of the picture. But he didn't say she stopped. He said Calvin wanted him gone. Not dead. Gone. Those aren't the same thing, are they? Grant had thought this himself. More than once. 20 years of it. No, he said carefully. They're not. So where is he? It was the question. The one underneath all the other questions. The one that had been sitting in the bottom of Aaron Vale's abandoned garage for 20 years, waiting for someone to be brave enough, or desperate enough, or loved enough to come looking. Naomi's phone rang. She stepped away, answered it, spoke in short words, listened for longer. Grant watched her face. He had known Naomi Pierce for 12 years, and he could read her expressions the way you learn to read weather, not the words, the conditions. What he saw right now was not what he expected. She came back. She looked at Grant, then at Haley. That was my contact at the state AG's office, she said. They pulled the case file on Aaron Vale. Missing persons, Reported 20 years ago, they found a note attached to the file from about 6 months after the initial report. She paused. There was an unidentified, injured male found near the Tennessee border, approximately 3 weeks after Aaron disappeared. Severe head trauma. No identification on him. He was conscious, but they used the word fragmented. Couldn't give his name. Couldn't give an address. He was transferred to a rehabilitation facility. She looked at the papers in her hand. The facility noted a single word that the man repeated consistently. They used it as his admission name. The room was quiet. North, Naomi said. They called him Adam North because it was the only word they could get from him that seemed to mean something. Grant looked at the compass in Haley's hand. The compass. Aaron Vale's compass. Engraved on the back, on the case, scratched from years of wear. No road is too long when someone is waiting. And on the front face, in small letters beneath the needle housing, the single word that had oriented Aaron Vale's entire adult life. North. Haley's hand closed around the compass. He's alive, she said. It was not a question. Nobody moved for a full 10 seconds after Naomi said the word. North. It hung in the air of that old garage like smoke, like something that had been waiting to be spoken for 20 years and was only now finding out what it felt like to exist outside of a file cabinet and a case number and the particular administrative indifference of a system that files unidentified. People under placeholder names and moves on to the next crisis. Grant was the first one to speak, and what he said was not what he'd planned to say. He'd planned to ask Naomi for specifics, the facility name, the timeline, the current status. Instead, what came out was quiet and almost involuntary. He's been alive this whole time. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't even surprise, exactly. It was the specific sound a man makes when something he has believed without evidence for 20 years turns out to have been true, and the relief and the grief arrive simultaneously, and he doesn't have a clean way to separate them. Naomi looked at him steadily. That's what the file suggests. My contact is still pulling records. There was a transfer. The initial facility that took him in was a county hospital near the border. But after about 3 months, they moved him to a long-term rehabilitation center. There's a gap after that. Records management from 20 years ago was not, she chose the word carefully, consistent. What does that mean? Haley asked. Her voice was level. Grant had stopped being surprised by her composure and started being impressed by it. It means there are records that should exist, and not, Naomi said. It means the transfer may have involved paperwork that was incomplete, or that subsequent record updates weren't connected to the original file. This was 2005, 2006. A lot of facilities were still on paper systems. She paused. It also means that if someone wanted to ensure a particular person remained lost, this was a fairly uncomplicated period in which to do that. The implications settled into the room like something cold. Calvin, Haley said. I can't prove that yet, Naomi said. But you're thinking it. I'm thinking a lot of things I can't prove yet. What I can tell you is that the name Adam North appears in the state's long-term care registry as recently as 14 months ago, which means that as of 14 months ago, a man by that name was alive and in the system. She looked at Haley. Whether that man is your father is something we establish with a DNA comparison. But the timeline fits. The injury type fits. The location fits. Haley was quiet. She was turning the compass over in her hands, the same motion she'd been doing since the parking lot, the same repetitive grounding gesture that Grant recognized as the physical expression of a mind moving too fast for the body to keep up with. He's been in a facility for 20 years, she said, not knowing who he was. Significant memory disruption following severe head trauma is it can be permanent or it can be partial. Sometimes people retain fragments. Skills, emotional memories, the recognition of familiar objects without the narrative context that explains them. Naomi said it carefully. The way you say things that are clinically true and humanly devastating. People can function at a reasonably high level in a structured environment while still being unable to reconstruct their own history. He remembered the word north, Haley said. Yes, because it was on the compass, and the compass was with him. Naomi hesitated. The initial report doesn't mention a compass. His personal effects at intake are listed as a jacket, a belt, damaged boots. No jewelry, no identification. Haley's hand closed tighter around the compass. Then, he didn't have it when they found him, she said, which means someone took it, or it wasn't with him when she stopped. When Calvin's people left him at the border. The word left was doing enormous work in that sentence, and everyone in the room understood what it was covering. Grant looked at the two men standing nearest him, Denny, and a man named Carver, who had been riding with the chapter for 16 years and who had known Aaron well enough to deliver a eulogy at a memorial service held 3 years after the disappearance, when enough time had passed that people needed somewhere formal to put their grief. Both of them had the same expression, which was the controlled, contained anger of men who have learned, over decades, that the first expression of that particular emotion is rarely the useful one. Naomi, Grant said. The facility. The one where he was 14 months ago. Where is it? That's the part I'm still working on, she said. The registry entry is current, but the facility address in the record links to a location in eastern Tennessee that my contact is checking whether it's still operating under the same name. Facilities change hands, merge, get absorbed. It's not unusual for the registry to lag behind operational reality by a few years. So we don't know where he is right now, Grant said. Not yet. No. He accepted that. There was nothing else to do with it. He walked to the workbench where the cassette player still sat. The tape inside it, the reels stopped at the end of Aaron Vale's voice. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the metal tube, the original, the one they'd found inside the motorcycle, and he carried it to Naomi. Everything gets copied twice more, he said. 1 copy to your contact at the AG. 1 copy to the Federal Vehicle Crimes Unit. Physical originals stay with you. He looked at her. Calvin Rusk did not drive out here to have a conversation. He drove out here because he thought he could still contain this. He can't. But that means his next move is going to be faster and less careful than his first ones. Agreed, Naomi said. Which means we need to be faster. He turned to the room. Not a speech. Grant Maddox had never been a man for speeches, for the formal, gathered weight of organized words. He was a man who said the specific thing that needed to be said and let the people around him do what they were going to do. I need 2 volunteers with clean records, no priors. Nothing that gives Calvin's lawyers a handle to ride to eastern Tennessee and physically locate that facility. I need Naomi's contact name and the last known address, and I need them on the road in the next 20 minutes. 2 hands went up before he finished the sentence. The rest of us stay here until Torres has everything he needs to file a formal report. After that, he paused. We figure out what comes next. Carver spoke up from the back. What about Haley? Grant looked at her. She was still on the workbench. She had taken the photograph out again, the one she'd carried all the way from Raleigh, through 2 nights of travel, into the parking lot that morning, and she was holding it next to the cassette player, the 2 objects side by side, her father's image and her father's voice, both of them 20 years old, and both of them suddenly, irrevocably real. She stays with us, Grant said. He said it the same way you say things that are not debatable. Not possessively, protectively, which is a completely different thing. Haley looked up. I'm right here, she said. You can ask me. Do you want to stay with us? Grant asked. She looked at the building around her, at the men who had ridden out here for a memorial and ended up somewhere entirely different. At Naomi, already on the phone again, already moving. At Denny, who had the cassette player under one arm and was standing near the door with the patient, solid presence of someone who had decided he was not leaving until she was ready to leave. Yes, she said, but I want to be the one who finds him. Grant looked at her for a moment. You will be, he said. I'll make sure of it. She nodded. And then something shifted in her face just briefly, just under the surface, and Grant recognized it because he had felt a version of it himself once, a long time ago, when he was 23 and his father had died suddenly and the world had rearranged itself overnight into a configuration he didn't recognize. The specific destabilizing vertigo of realizing that the story you've been living is not the story that was actually happening. She was 20 years old, and she'd run through a parking lot with no shoes and an old photograph and the courage of someone who had decided that the truth was worth whatever it cost to find it. He thought Aaron would have been proud of her. He thought Aaron might still get the chance to tell her so. Torres finished his preliminary report 40 minutes later and told Grant he'd be in contact within 24 hours. He took the physical copies of the ledger pages and left the originals with Naomi. And he drove away with the specific expression of a man whose Tuesday had gone considerably off script and who was choosing to treat that as professionally interesting rather than personally inconvenient. Grant respected that. The two volunteers, a man named Skiff and a younger writer called Pete, both of whom had the kind of quietly verifiable records that came from 30 years of deliberate, boring legal citizenship left for Tennessee before the sheriff's cruiser was out of sight. Naomi had given them the facility address, a name to ask for, and her own direct number with instructions to call the moment they had eyes on the location. That left the rest of them in the open space of Aaron's old garage, with Aaron's motorcycle in the center of it, and Aaron's voice still in the air from the tape, and the specific collective restlessness of a large group of people who have done the immediate thing and are now waiting for the next thing to become clear. Grant went and stood next to the motorcycle. He hadn't touched it yet. He hadn't let himself. He'd been managing the situation. Calvin, Torres, the evidence, the volunteers, Haley, keeping himself in motion, because motion was how he processed things. But now, in the quiet between the urgent and the next urgent, he put his hand on the tank of Aaron Vale's bike and let himself be still for a moment. 20 years. Aaron had been alive somewhere for 20 years. Alive but not himself. Alive but not knowing. Alive but carrying the weight of a life he couldn't access in a body that still, apparently, responded to the word north, the way a compass needle responds to magnetic pull. Not because he understood why. Just because something in him remembered that it mattered. Grant's hand tightened on the tank. Haley came and stood next to him. She didn't say anything. She looked at the bike the same way he was looking at it, as an object that contained a person, as something that held the shape of someone who wasn't there. "Tell me about him," she said. Grant looked at her. "I know what the letters say," she said. "I know what the tape says. I know what his handwriting looks like, and I know what his voice sounds like," which is she stopped for a moment, more than I expected to have today. "But I don't know what he was like, as a person." Day to day, Grant thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which meant not smoothing it into something clean and eulogistic, because Haley Monroe had shown him in the last 3 hours that she was a person who wanted the real version of things. He was late, Grant said. Chronically, structurally. It wasn't disrespect. He was always early to things that mattered. Rides, mechanical emergencies, anything where someone was counting on him to be there. But ordinary things, meetings, lunch, showing up when he said he'd show up. He moved at his own pace, and he knew it, and he didn't apologize for it because he figured the people who knew him knew it, and the people who didn't know him well. Enough yet for it to matter. Haley almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles around her mouth moved. He was funny, Grant continued. Not joke funny, observational. He'd say one thing, quiet, in the middle of a group conversation, and it would be so precisely accurate about whatever was happening that you'd still be thinking about it 3 days later. Half the time you'd laugh at the wrong moment, because the delay was that long. "My mother said something like that," Haley said, in one of the letters he'd written her. He'd made a comment about, "I can't remember the exact thing," but she wrote back that she didn't understand what was funny about it. And then 2 days later, she wrote again and said she was laughing in the grocery store, and a woman asked if she was all right. Grant laughed. It came out more completely than he intended. "That's exactly right. That's yes. That's him." She looked at the bike. Was he happy? Generally? Before all this? Grant considered it. He was working towards something, he said finally. "I think happy is complicated for people who are working towards something." He wasn't miserable. He wasn't restless in the bad way. He was purposeful. Like, he had a picture of what things should look like, and every day was a step in that direction. Your mother was part of it. You were part of it. This, he gestured at the bike, was part of it. He was building something. And Calvin took it apart, Haley said. Calvin tried. She looked at Grant. What do you mean? Tried. Grant looked at her. He's alive, he said. The evidence made it to the right people today. You're here. The things Aaron built that mattered, they survived. He let that land. Calvin didn't finish the job on any of it. Haley was quiet for a moment. Then, that's either the most comforting thing you could have said or the most terrifying. Probably both. Naomi's voice came from across the room. Sharp and quick, Grant. He turned. She was standing with her phone up. Expression changed. Not alarmed. Exactly, Naomi Pierce did not alarm easily, but focused in the specific way that meant something had shifted. My contact at the AG called back, she said. They ran Calvin Rusk through their existing case database. His name appears in an investigation that opened 18 months ago. A federal investigation. She paused. Into a network of fraudulent vehicle title transactions spanning 4 states, operating primarily through a chain of shell companies. The lead investigator has been building it for 3 years. They've been looking for the original documentation that can tie Calvin directly to the earliest operations, proof of when it started, how it was structured before the shell company layer was added. She looked at the metal tube in her hand. The ledgers in here predate all of it. They're the foundation. Grant stared at her. They've been building a case against Calvin Rusk for 3 years, he said slowly, and they didn't have the foundation until today. Aaron's records closed the case. They could close several cases, and they implicate people beyond Calvin. The names in the ledger include at least 2 individuals who appear in the federal investigation under other contexts. She lowered the phone slightly. Grant, this isn't a 20-year-old local fraud case. This is the piece that federal prosecutors have been missing for 3 years. He let that settle. He thought about Aaron, 29 years old, working late in a shop, realizing that the documentation he'd been quietly assembling was more significant than he'd understood. Realizing that the man he'd uncovered wasn't just running a theft ring. He was the connective tissue of something larger, older, more entrenched, and understanding at some point in those last weeks before he disappeared that what he was holding was dangerous enough to make him a target for anyone who felt the exposure risk. Aaron hadn't just found a crime. He'd found the evidence that could unravel a network, and he'd hidden it inside a motorcycle and written a letter to his daughter and told her to follow the compass north when she was old enough, because he hadn't known if he was going to survive long enough to hand it over himself. Grant thought about that for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, he knew what he had. He knew exactly what he had, Naomi said. Haley was listening to all of this. Her face had gone through several adjustments in the last 60 seconds, understanding, recalibration, something that might have been the specific kind of pride that comes with discovering that someone you never knew was exactly the person you would have wanted them to be. He protected it, she said. He protected it for 20 years, Naomi said, by hiding it somewhere that only someone who loved him would know to look. He protected me, Haley said, by hiding it somewhere that if Calvin had ever found it, if anyone had ever found it before, now he would have had no reason to come after me. As long as it was hidden, I was just a kid with no connection to any of it. Her voice was very measured, very precise. He kept me out of it by keeping the evidence invisible. As long as it was invisible, I was invisible too. The room absorbed that. And then from outside they heard it, not the SUVs. Different. 2 vehicles, higher engine note, coming down the county road faster than the SUVs had come, which meant something different in character, not the controlled, strategic arrival of a man who had calculated his options, but something more urgent, more reactive, more like an action that had been decided on quickly and was now being executed without the usual level of care. Grant was at the roll-up door in 4 steps. 2 vehicles pulled up, a pickup truck, dark, and a sedan. Not police, not Calvin's SUVs. 3 men got out of the truck and 2 from the sedan, and they were not dressed like men who had been at a business meeting. One of them, the one from the passenger side of the truck, the one who reached the front of the group first, was a man Grant had never seen before. Heavy set, somewhere in his late 50s, the kind of face that suggested he had been making inconvenient problems disappear for a long time and had stopped finding it interesting. He looked at the crowd of bikers, still there, still present, 150 of them arranged, outside the building in the loose, instinctive perimeter that had formed hours ago and hadn't dissolved because nobody had given the signal to dissolve it, and he evaluated the situation. And he stopped walking. Because that was the calculation. That was the specific arithmetic that Calvin Rusk had apparently communicated to whoever he'd called after leaving this property 20 minutes ago. Go get what they left behind. Deal with whatever's there. And whoever was on the other end of that call had dispatched these men without fully understanding what whatever's there meant in concrete terms. It meant 150. The man looked at Grant. Grant looked at the man. Can I help you? Grant said. The man said nothing. This is private property, Grant said. Privately held. If you have business with the estate of Gerald Pruitt, you're welcome to contact the relevant parties through legal channels. If you have business with me or any member of my chapter, you're also welcome to begin that conversation. He paused. Or you can get back in those vehicles and drive away, and we can all pretend this didn't happen. And you can go back and tell whoever sent you that the situation was not as manageable as described. One of the other men had his hand near his jacket pocket. One of Grant's people, Carver, who had been standing near the door for the last hour, moved a quarter step and put himself at an angle that made the geometry of any such gesture very unfavorable. Nobody touched anything. The heavy-set man looked at the building behind Grant. He was doing the same math Calvin had done, but he was arriving at the same answer faster because he didn't have Calvin's 20 years of practiced management to make him think the math might come out differently. Tell Rusk we said hello, Grant said. The man held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned, without a word, and walked back to the truck. The others followed. The two vehicles reversed down the gravel approach and disappeared onto the county road. Grant stood where he was until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he turned back inside. Naomi already had Torres's number up on her phone. I'm reporting the incident, she said. Good. Grant looked at Haley, who had watched the whole exchange through the gap between two men standing near the door, her expression so focused and controlled that it took him a moment to notice her hands were shaking slightly at her sides. He recognized that, the body releasing what the mind had been refusing to process. He walked over to her and spoke quietly. It's all right, I know, she said. I know it is. She stopped, breathed. I grew up in a house with that man. He sat at our table. He came to my school events. And he sent people here today because what's in Satub threatens him, and he doesn't, another breath. He doesn't see me as a person. He never did. I was just part of managing a situation. Grant didn't try to fix it. There was nothing to fix. It was true, and she knew it was true. And the specific pain of that truth was not the kind that responds to consolation. Your father saw you as a person, he said instead. Before you were born. Before he knew anything about who you'd be. He built all of this around the idea that someday you would be a person capable of finding it. She was quiet. He was right, Grant said. Her hands had stopped shaking. Naomi ended her call to Torres and walked over with her phone face up. Skiff just sent a message, she said. Grant looked at the screen. Facility is still operating. Different name now, Blue Ridge Recovery and Rehabilitation Center. About 40 miles outside of Knoxville. Pete is talking to someone inside, standing by. And then, 30 seconds later, a second message. Adam North is still here, has been here continuously. They say he's ambulatory, communicative, functional within the facility. They say he has good days and harder days. They say he asks about a motorcycle sometimes. They say he has never been able to explain why. Grant read the message twice. Then he handed the phone to Haley. She read it. She read it again. She set the phone down on the workbench, next to the cassette player, next to the photograph, next to the tube that had held 20 years of her father's truth inside a machine he'd built with his own hands. She picked up the compass. She turned it over. No road is too long when someone is waiting. I want to go there, she said. Grant had been expecting that. had been prepared for it. He looked at Naomi, who gave the smallest nod legally. Procedurally, they needed to control the timeline carefully. They needed to ensure that the first contact was managed properly, that there was medical staff present, that the right people were informed. All of that was true. All of that was necessary, and none of it changed what he said next. "Get your things," he said. "We leave in 10 minutes. Haley looked at him. "All of you?" He looked at the room. He looked at the men in the doorway and the men outside, and the man who had driven out here on a September morning to honor a friend he'd believed was dead. "As many as the road will hold," he said. And somewhere in eastern Tennessee, in a rehabilitation facility that had been operating under a different name for the last several years, a man who did not know his own past was sitting in the kind of chair you sit in when the routine of a day has become the only structure available to you. And he was looking at his hands the way he sometimes did, not knowing why. Just feeling that they remembered something his mind had lost, and he was waiting, as he had been waiting for 20 years, without understanding that he was waiting for something to come back to him from a direction he could not name. The needle on a compass doesn't know it's pointing north. It just points. Some things are like that. The engine started. The ride to Tennessee took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Grant knew because he checked his watch when they pulled out of the gravel approach outside Black Mountain, and again when the sign for the county route that Skiff had texted appeared on the right side of the highway. 2 hours and 14 minutes during which Haley sat in Denny's sidecar with her hand flat over the compass and her eyes forward. And the mountain roads opened and closed around them. And nobody said anything because there was nothing left to say that the morning hadn't already said better. Naomi had made 4 calls on the ride. Grant knew the shape of them from the fragments he caught when they stopped at a light. The AG contact, a medical advocacy attorney she knew from a case 3 years back, someone at the facility itself, and one call that she made very quietly with her body angled away from the group that Grant suspected was to a federal contact she hadn't mentioned yet. Naomi operated on a need-to-know basis that Grant had always respected because it had always produced results. Skiff and Pete were waiting at the turnoff when they arrived. Pete was 27, the youngest man in the chapter, and he had the look of someone who had spent the last hour talking to strangers and learning things that he was not entirely sure how to process. He fell in beside Grant the moment Grant killed his engine. "The facility director's name is Margaret Oakes," Pete said. "She's been there 11 years. She knows Adam North. She knows him well. She says he's one of their long-term residents. She says he stopped, started again. She got emotional when I explained why I was there. She said she always thought there was more to his story. She said he has a quality that's her word, quality that doesn't fit someone who just got lost. She said it feels like someone who got put somewhere and couldn't find the door out." Grant absorbed that. "Does she know we're coming?" "She's expecting you. She's expecting Haley." Pete looked at the sidecar, where Haley was climbing out, compass in hand, the photograph in her jacket pocket. "She asked one thing." "What?" "She asked that however this goes, however he responds, you give him time. She said his cognition is good on most days, but his emotional responses can run ahead of his processing. She said if he gets overwhelmed, he goes somewhere internal, and it can take a while to come back." Pete paused. "She said don't rush him, even if it's hard not to." Grant looked at Haley. Haley had heard all of it. Haley had heard all of it. She was standing with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her jaw doing the thing it did when she was making a decision that she was going to stick to, regardless of the cost. "I won't rush him," she said. "I've waited 20 years. Another hour isn't going to break anything." Pete nodded. Then quietly, like he felt he needed to say it, "Miss Monroe Oakes also said that there are days when he's very present. Sharp, almost. Like something in him is still trying to get back to the surface." He hesitated. "She said, today has been a good day." Haley pressed her lips together. "Breathe through her nose." "Good," she said. "Good." Margaret Oakes met them at the front entrance, a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the unhurried, grounded presence of someone who had spent decades managing the space between hope and reality and had learned to hold both without letting either one distort the other. She shook Grant's hand. She shook Naomi's hand. She turned to Haley and she looked at her, the way you look at someone you've been expecting, in a way you couldn't have named until the moment they showed up. You have his eyes, Margaret Oakes said. I noticed it the moment you came through the door. She said it plainly, not sentimentally, just as a fact that mattered. Haley couldn't answer that. She nodded. He's in the garden, Margaret said. He likes the garden in the afternoon. It's the best time of day for him. His orientation is clearest. His speech is most organized. She looked at Grant. I want to explain something before you go in. For 20 years, the people responsible for his care did their best with limited information. He was admitted as an unidentified patient. He was given a functional identity for administrative purposes, and the system accommodated him within its existing capacity. She paused. But systems don't chase the truth. They manage what they're given. Nobody came looking for Aaron Vale, and so nobody found Adam North. And those two facts coexisted for 20 years without anyone connecting them. Someone made sure nobody came looking, Naomi said. It was not a question. Margaret Oakes looked at her steadily. I have been the director of this facility for 11 years. In that time, there have been 3 instances where individuals claiming to represent family or legal interests contacted us about Adam North. In each case, the contact was not from family. In each case, the inquiry seemed designed to confirm that he was still here and that he had not recovered significant memory. In each case, the contact information provided was not verifiable. She paused. I flagged each instance in his file, and I notified the state ombudsman's office. I was told the contacts had been investigated and posed no concern. She said the last sentence, the way you say things, you have always believed, were wrong and are not surprised to have confirmed. The weight of that moved through the group. He was being monitored, Grant said. He was being checked on, Margaret said. There is a distinction in intent but not in effect. She removed her glasses from the chain and put them on. What I want you to understand is that whatever comes next, the legal process, the medical process, the personal process, Adam North, or Aaron Vale, is a person who has been living a specific life for 20 years. He has relationships here. He has a routine. He has a self, even if that self is built from incomplete materials. Whatever he recovers, and I want to be honest with you, that recovery at this stage is genuinely uncertain. Whatever he recovers will not erase the last 20 years. It will have to coexist with them. She looked at Haley again. Are you prepared for that? Haley looked at her. I didn't come here to get my father back the way he was, she said. I don't know who he was. I came here to meet him. Margaret Oakes held her gaze for a moment. Then she took off her glasses. All right, she said. Follow me. She took only Haley and Grant through the interior. The others waited, which they did without being asked, reading the room the way they'd been reading rooms all day. Naomi stayed near the entrance with her phone, already composing the message to her AG contact about Margaret's disclosure regarding the 3 monitoring inquiries, which was a thread that would unravel considerably more in the weeks ahead. The garden was a courtyard, accessible through a pair of glass doors at the end of a corridor lined with the small, personal markers of long-term residents, a bulletin board with photographs, a shelf of donated books with handwritten names inside the covers. The institutional, warm aesthetic of a place that has been trying for a very long time to feel like something other than an institution. Margaret stopped at the glass doors. He's at the far bench, she said quietly. He may look up when the door opens. He may not. Don't take either as a signal. It depends on where he is in his thoughts. She looked at Grant. Would you let her go first? Alone? Grant looked at Haley. Yes, Haley said, before he could answer. She pushed through the glass door before she could decide not to. Grant stood at the glass and watched. The man on the bench was 51 years old. Grant had last seen him at 31 in a garage outside Asheville, 2 days before he disappeared. And the 20 years showed the way 20 years always show in the way weight redistributes. In the gray that replaces color, in the slight forward slope of shoulders that have been carrying something for a long time. But the jaw was the same, the way he held his head, slightly tilted, the particular angle of attention of a man who was listening to something not quite audible that was the same. Grant had seen it 1,000 times. It was one of those things you didn't know you had memorized until you saw it again. He was looking at his hands. Haley walked toward him. She got to about 10 feet away and stopped. She didn't say anything. She was holding the compass, not wearing it, holding it out slightly from her body, not as a gesture toward him, just the way you hold something when your hands need to be doing something while the rest of you figures out what to do next. The man on the bench looked up. He looked at her the way people look at strangers, the initial automatic assessment, the social recognition of another person in your space. And then something happened in his face. Not recognition, not a name or a history clicking into place, but something. The way a tuning fork responds to its frequency, not intellectual, not conscious, just resonant. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you," he said. His voice was the voice from the tape. 20 years older, but unmistakably the same register, the same quiet weight. Haley's breath came out in a short, hard exhale, like someone had pressed on her chest. "I don't think you do," she said. "Not yet." He tilted his head. "Your hair." His voice was careful. He spoke the way people speak when they are trying to be precise about something that is on the edge of their ability to articulate. "I've seen there's a photograph. I don't have it, but I've seen it. In my mind. A woman with hair like that. Standing by it." He stopped. "A motorcycle." Haley's hand tightened around the compass. "Her name was Rebecca," Haley said. "She was my mother." The man on the bench went very still. "I'm Haley," she said. "I'm your daughter." The silence that followed was not the silence of incomprehension. It was the silence of a man whose mind was attempting to do something it had not been able to do for 20 years, and was feeling, for the first time in all of that time, that the thing might be possible. He looked at her face, piece by piece. The forehead, the jaw, the eyes. "Haley," he said. He said it the way it appeared in the letter. The way Aaron Vale had written it, not a name he'd been given. A name he'd chosen, a name he'd written, in his careful, deliberate handwriting to a woman he loved about a person who didn't exist yet, a placeholder for someone who would arrive and become real. He said it like a word he'd known before he knew its meaning. Haley reached out and placed the compass in his open hand. She had to reach forward to do it. She'd stayed at her respectful distance, respecting Margaret's instruction, not rushing. And when her hand made contact with his to deposit the compass, neither of them pulled back immediately. His fingers closed around hers for just a moment, not grasping, just present, acknowledging. Then he looked down at the compass. He turned it over. He read the engraving on the back, and something moved across his face that was neither complete recognition nor complete confusion, but somewhere between them, the emotional memory arriving before the factual memory, the feeling of the thing without yet having all the words for it. His eyes were wet. He wasn't performing that. It was just happening. The way physical responses happen when the body processes what the mind cannot yet fully contain. "No road is too long," he said slowly. "When someone is waiting," Haley finished. He looked up at her. "I've been waiting," she said. "I didn't know it. I didn't know your name until 6 months ago. But I've been waiting." She stopped, swallowed. "My mother waited too, her whole life. She never told me why, but now I think I understand." The man who had been Adam North for 20 years held Aaron Vale's compass and looked at Aaron Vale's daughter and did not say anything for a long time because there was nothing available to him that was equal to the moment, and he was intelligent enough to know it. And so he simply held what he had been given and let it be true. Grant was crying. He realized it when the glass in front of him went blurry. He hadn't cried, and he couldn't remember. He wasn't embarrassed by it. He just registered it as information. That was the kind of moment this was. The kind where 20 years of wait had somewhere to go. Finally, and the body took the opportunity without waiting for permission. He pushed through the door. He crossed the garden. Aaron looked up from the compass and saw Grant coming. And something happened in his face that was faster and cleaner than what had happened when he saw Haley, because Grant's face was a face Aaron Vale had looked at 10,000 times in the years before his memory was taken. And the body remembers what the mind loses. And the body recognized Grant Maddox before the conscious mind could even formulate the question. Grant, Aaron said. It came out rough and certain, not a question. Grant sat down on the bench next to him. He didn't say anything clever. He didn't try to sum up 20 years or explain the morning or contextualize any of the extraordinary sequence of events that had led three people to a garden in eastern Tennessee on a September afternoon. He put his hand on Aaron's shoulder. "Hey, brother," he said. Aaron exhaled slowly. His shoulders dropped the forward slope, releasing slightly. The long-held tension of a body that had been braced for 20 years against something it couldn't name but could still feel. "I knew someone was coming," he said. "I didn't know how I knew. I've known it for I can't tell you how long. Just a sense, like a road that goes somewhere if you stay on it." "You stayed on it," Grant said. "I didn't know how to get off," Aaron said. And there was something almost like the dry humor that Grant remembered something in the delivery, in the timing, in the specific quality of understatement. Not a joke, but the shape of one. Grant laughed despite everything. "That sounds like you," he said. Aaron looked at him. "Tell me what I've missed." And there it was, right there. The most Aaron Vale sentence that had ever been spoken, not "what happened to me," not "what do I do now," not the inward-facing language of someone who had just received the most disorienting news of their life. But tell me what I've missed. The instinctive orientation outward, toward other people, toward the world, toward the things happening beyond his own situation. Grant looked at Haley. Haley looked at her father. "A lot," Grant said. "We'll get there." What came next was not a single conversation. It was several, conducted over the following 4 hours, in the garden and then inside at a table in the common room, with Margaret Oakes present for parts of it, and a staff counselor named Daniel present for others, because Margaret understood that what was happening required more than goodwill and emotional momentum. It required structure and pacing and someone in the room who could read the line between processing and overwhelm. Naomi, in the meantime, was conducting a parallel operation. By the time Haley and Aaron had spent 2 hours together halting, careful, real Naomi had spoken to 3 people at the state AG's office, 1 person at the Federal Vehicle Crimes Unit, and a civil attorney specializing in conservatorship fraud. The picture she was assembling was consistent and damning. Calvin Rusk had not obtained his conservatorship over Haley through legitimate medical concern. The doctor who'd signed the evaluation, Philip Hart, was not a stranger. He had received consulting fees from a company, 2 corporate layers removed from Calvin's primary holding company, for 8 consecutive years. The evaluation itself contained language that Naomi's contact described as boilerplate stock phrases that appeared with slight variations in other contested conservatorship cases in the same county, suggesting a template, suggesting a practice. Calvin had been using the conservatorship not to protect Haley, but to control her access to her mother's estate, and specifically to control her access to a piece of property that Rebecca Monroe had unknowingly inherited from Aaron Vale through a trust Aaron had established before he disappeared, administered by a third party who had dutifully held it for 20 years, waiting for the named beneficiary to claim it. The property was not large, but it contained the garage, Aaron's garage, the one outside Black Mountain. Calvin had known about the trust for years. He had known that the property and whatever was in it would transfer to Haley upon her 21st birthday or upon her mother's death, whichever came first. Rebecca had died 6 months before Haley's 21st birthday. The conservatorship had been filed 11 months before Rebecca died. Calvin had been preparing for this moment for years. Naomi delivered that summary to Grant in the corridor outside the common room, her voice low and precise, while through the door's narrow window, Grant could see Haley sitting across from Aaron at the table. Both of them looking at the photograph, the original, the one Haley had carried from Raleigh, the image of Rebecca and an infant and a black motorcycle, and a man who was now sitting 4 feet from the daughter in the photograph. He planned all of it, Grant said. He planned to be positioned when the moment came, Naomi said. The conservatorship was the mechanism. If he controlled Haley's legal and financial capacity, He controlled her ability to claim the property. And if she couldn't claim the property, the trust would eventually lapse and revert, and he could acquire it through a third-party transaction that would look entirely unconnected. He wanted the garage, Grant said. He wanted what he believed was in the garage. She paused. He was right that something was there. He was wrong about his ability to get to it. Because Haley ran. Because Haley ran, Naomi agreed. And she ran toward the right people. Through the window, Grant watched Aaron pick up the photograph. He watched the way Aaron's hands moved with it, careful, recognizing the particular tenderness of someone handling something that their memory is reaching toward faster than their mind can follow. He watched Haley, watching her father, hold the image of her mother. Neither of them was saying anything. They didn't need to. Some moments have enough weight that language is surplus. What happens to Calvin now? Grant asked. The conservatorship is suspended as of this afternoon. I got confirmation 20 minutes ago. An emergency motion citing conflict of interest and fraudulent basis. Haley's identification and her mother's documents are to be returned to her within 48 hours. Naomi scrolled on her phone. The federal investigation is a longer road. These things move at their own pace. But the evidence from the tube is now in the hands of people who've been building this case for 3 years, and they have described it as she found the message, the missing structural link. Their words. He'll be arrested, Grant said. Eventually, possibly for more than the vehicle fraud. The AG's office is looking at the monitoring contacts to this facility as potential evidence tampering in the original Aaron Vale investigation, which was technically an open missing persons case. She looked at Grant. If they can establish that Calvin knowingly had Aaron left at the Tennessee border and then took actions to ensure he remained unidentified, that's not just fraud, Grant said. No, Naomi said. That is considerably not just fraud. They were both quiet for a moment. He's going to try one more move, Grant said, before the walls close. He's done it every time today, evaluated, recalculated, tried a different angle. He doesn't just stop. I know. Naomi put her phone away. That's why I asked Torres to flag his travel documents this afternoon. He can't leave the country. He can't move assets out of state above a threshold. The AG contacted the federal team an hour ago. If he makes a move, it creates a paper trail that helps the case more than it hurts. Grant nodded slowly. You've been 3 steps ahead of this all day. 2 steps, she said. I had a moment around the time those men showed up at the garage when I was genuinely at 1 step. She considered it. That was uncomfortable. He almost smiled. He went back into the common room. Aaron looked up when Grant came in. There was something different in his face now, the same quality that Margaret Oakes had described as a good day, but more organized, more present, like the afternoon had done something that years had not. Not recovery, not a sudden return of everything that had been taken, but an anchoring, a sense of location, like a compass finding its bearing after a long time of spinning. She told me about the motorcycle, Aaron said when Grant sat down. Which part? That you kept it. All of them. He looked at his hands, then at Grant. I was always going to finish it. I had about 60 hours of work left on the engine. He paused. I remember that. I don't always know what year it is. I don't always know the full sequence of things. But I remember I had 60 hours left on that engine, and I was trying to figure out how to finish it before the baby came because I wanted her to hear it when it was right. Haley was very still across the table. We kept it exactly as it was, Grant said. Nobody touched it. Aaron absorbed that. Why? Grant looked at him. Because it was yours, and we figured you'd want it back. Aaron nodded slowly. The way you nod when something is so straightforwardly what it should be that there's nothing to add to it. Then he looked at Haley. I'm sorry, he said. She shook her head. Let me say it, he said. I know there's a version of this where you tell me it's not my fault, and I know there's a version where you're right. But I need to say it anyway, because you went 20 years without a father, and I went 20 without knowing you, and neither of these things should have happened, and I'm sorry. Haley's composure did a complicated thing. It held, but barely. I found you, she said. That's what matters to me. I found you. You did, he said. Your mother always said you'd be stubborn. Something shifted in his voice, a different register, more distant, and then more present again. I don't have all of her. My memories of her they come in pieces, but I have the important ones. He looked at the photograph still on the table between them. I have this. Haley reached out and pushed the photograph across to him. Keep it, she said. I know what it shows. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. What happened to her, he asked. In the end. He stopped. Was it peaceful? Haley thought about her mother. The 4 hours of talking on a good day. The hand held without words. The specific quality of quiet that Rebecca Monroe had cultivated across 20 years of a life, lived carefully around a man she didn't love, preserving something, a name, a truth, a compass, a false bottom in a jewelry box for a daughter who would need it. She was brave, Haley said. Her whole life, she kept everything safe. She made sure I would find it when I needed to. Aaron looked at the photograph and did not say anything, because the grief and the gratitude were arriving simultaneously, and they were both too large for words. After a moment, he said, very quietly, that sounds exactly like her. Outside, in the parking area, 147 members of the Hells Angels, chapter of Asheville, North Carolina, were waiting on a Tuesday afternoon in September for whatever came next. Some of them had been there for 6 hours. None of them had left. Denny Marsh had organized a food run at some point. 2 of the younger men had come back with sandwiches and coffee from a diner 3 miles up the highway, and the group had settled into the particular patient, collective stillness of people who have decided that what they are waiting for is worth the wait. Margaret Oakes, who had been running a rehabilitation facility for 11 years and had seen a great deal of what human beings were capable of toward each other and walked to the front entrance and looked out at the parking area for a long moment. Then she went back to her desk and she called the state ombudsman's office and told them she had information about 3 historical inquiry attempts regarding a long-term resident that she now believed to have been made in bad faith by parties with an interest in that resident's continued anonymity. She said it the way she said everything, unhurried, precise, complete. And then Calvin Rusk made his move. Grant's phone rang at 4:47 in the afternoon. Torres, the deputy, Mr. Maddox. We just got a report that a complaint has been filed by a Calvin Rusk against Haley Monroe, alleging that she has been taken against her will by members of a known motorcycle organization. Torres's voice was level, professionally level, the kind that means the person speaking it has already formed a view and is managing their expression of it carefully. The complaint is at the county level in Raleigh. Mr. Rusk is claiming she is in need of protective intervention under the terms of the existing conservatorship. Grant was quiet for exactly 1 second. The conservatorship was suspended this afternoon, he said. Yes, sir. We're aware. The suspension hasn't propagated to the Raleigh County system, yet there's a processing lag, which means for approximately the next 12 to 18 hours, there is a paper basis for a welfare check request that a cooperative local unit might act on. Torres paused. I am not a cooperative local unit, but I can't speak to other jurisdictions. Grant understood immediately. He's trying to get a welfare check with teeth in it. Get someone to Haley before the suspension processes. Physical custody under the conservatorship. That's my read. Yes. What do we do? You have 2 things that beat a welfare check, Torres said. A legal affidavit from the individual in question establishing that she is there voluntarily and that the conservatorship basis is fraudulent, and a second affidavit from a licensed medical professional confirming her competence. He paused. If you could have both of those in my hands within the hour, I can make some calls that would make a Raleigh welfare check a complicated undertaking. Grant looked through the common room window. Naomi was already inside, which meant she had either heard or anticipated, because Naomi Pierce operated on frequencies that most people couldn't access. Give me 45 minutes, Grant said. Naomi had the affidavits drafted in 20. Margaret Oakes signed the medical competence confirmation in the time it takes a woman who has been waiting 11 years to do something meaningful about a situation she's always known was wrong. Haley signed her own statement with a hand that did not shake once. Grant transmitted everything to Torres at 5:31. Calvin Rusk's welfare check request was denied at 6:15. The denial was logged. The logging was attached to the existing case file. The attempt to use a suspended conservatorship as an instrument of coercion was, as Naomi put it to her AG contact, exactly the kind of active bad faith that would look very interesting to a federal judge. Calvin's last move had become his most useful gift to the people building the case against him. Grant sat with Aaron in the common room at 7 in the evening, while Haley talked to Daniel the counselor about what the next steps would look like the DNA confirmation, the process of establishing Aaron's legal identity, the medical and legal pathway back to a life that had been suspended rather than ended. It was a long conversation. It would not be the last long conversation. There would be months of them ahead, and the months would be difficult in ways that this particular September day, for all its revelations, could not fully prepare anyone for. But Aaron was present for it. He was here. He was Aaron, and he was also the man who had survived 20 years in an assisted facility under a borrowed name. And both of those things were true at once, and the truth of both of them together was going to be what he and his daughter had to build from. Aaron was looking at the photograph. "I used to have this dream," he said, without looking up. "In the early years, I didn't know it was a memory. I thought it was a dream. A woman and a baby and a bike and a feeling." He stopped. "You know what it felt like? It felt like the end of a long road, like arriving somewhere." Grant didn't say anything. "I had it less as the years went on," Aaron said. "I was afraid of that. That it was leaving." He turned the photograph over and read the back. Nothing was written there, but he turned it anyway, the way ye handle something precious. "Now I know it wasn't leaving. It was just waiting." He looked up at Grant. "She found me," he said. "She found you," Grant said. Aaron's jaw moved. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Something passed across his face, that 20 years and a serious head injury and 2 decades of living, as Adam North could not flatten or diminish the specific expression of a man who has spent a very long time separated from what he loves and has, against the odds and without fully understanding how, arrived back in proximity to it. "She's stubborn," he said. "Very," Grant agreed. "Good." Aaron looked back at the photograph. "That's what I was hoping for." The DNA results came back on a Thursday morning, 11 days after September. Naomi called Haley at 7:42. Haley was in her mother's kitchen. She'd been staying in Rebecca's house since the conservatorship was suspended, sleeping in her childhood bed, moving through rooms that smelled like her mother and felt like a before version of a life she was still figuring out how to continue. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that she hadn't drunk yet, and she was looking at the window, the way you look at things when your mind is somewhere else entirely. She picked up on the first ring. Naomi said, "It's confirmed." Haley set the coffee down. "Aaron David Vale is your biological father," Naomi said. "The lab ran it twice. The match is definitive." Outside the window, a bird was doing something ordinary in a tree. Haley watched it without seeing it. "Okay," she said, "okay?" Naomi's voice carried the particular quality of a woman who had expected a larger reaction. "I knew," Haley said. "I knew from the moment I turned that compass over and read the engraving. I knew from the photograph. I knew from the letters. I knew from she stopped. I knew from the way he said my name in the garden. You don't say a name like that if it doesn't belong to you." She picked the coffee back up. "The paper just makes it official." "The paper does considerably more than that," Naomi said, shifting to the register she used when she had a structured list of things to get through. "The conservatorship is formally dissolved as of yesterday. I have documentation of that, and I'm filing a supporting motion today that will flag the fraudulent basis for any future legal reference. Your mother's estate, her house, her accounts, the personal property transfers to you without encumbrance. The trust Aaron established before he disappeared, held in administration for 20 years, is now releasing to you. The primary asset in that trust is the property in Black Mountain." "The garage," Haley said. "The garage. And the land it sits on, which is more substantial than the building itself would suggest. The property taxes have been paid out of the trust's administrative account for 2 decades. It's yours free and clear." A pause. "Haley, between your mother's estate and the trust, you're not. I want to make sure you understand the financial picture here. because I think you've spent the last several months believing you had less stability than you actually have. Haley was quiet for a moment. He planned for me. He planned for you very carefully. The trust language is specific. He anticipated not the exact events, but the shape of them. There are provisions for contested access, provisions for delayed claim, provisions for scenarios where the beneficiary might need legal support to establish their identity. Naomi's voice carried something that was not quite emotion and not quite its absence, the professional warmth of someone who had read a legal document written by a 29-year-old man protecting his unborn daughter and had been moved by it in spite of themselves. He was thorough. He was also terrified. Both things come through in the language. Haley pressed her hand flat on the kitchen counter. The same grounding gesture. Her body had its own vocabulary now. What about Aaron, she asked. Legally. His identity. The petition to restore his legal identity is filed. It will take 4 to 6 weeks to process through the court. In the meantime, he has a provisional identification document that allows him to interface with the medical and social service systems under his own name. Margaret Oakes's facility has agreed to continue his care and treatment under the corrected identity during the transition period. Naomi paused. She also told me something this morning. She said that since you visited, he's been different. Her word was anchored. She said he'd always been functional, but now he seems like someone who knows why he's functioning. Haley didn't say anything to that because she didn't have words for what it did to her chest. There's one more thing, Naomi said. Her tone changed. Lower, more careful. About Calvin. Haley set the coffee down again. Federal charges were filed yesterday morning. The vehicle crimes unit moved faster than I expected. I think the structural nature of Aaron's ledgers made it straightforward to connect to the existing investigation. Calvin Rusk is facing 12 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice related to the original disappearance investigation. She paused. The obstruction charge is the significant one. The AG's office has established, through the 3 monitoring contacts to Margaret's facility, that Calvin was aware Aaron Vale was alive and deliberately took steps to prevent his identification. That is not a financial crime. That is a crime against a person. Good, Haley said. There's a bail hearing next week. I'd like you to attend. Not to testify, not yet. But I'd like him to see you in that room. I'd like him to understand that you are not a variable he's still managing. Haley thought about that. About the parking lot on the morning of the memorial ride, Calvin stepping out of his gray SUV with his cufflinks straight and his voice measured and his entire manner communicating that she was a situation to be handled. She thought about 23 years of a household built on the architecture of that assumption, that she was manageable, that she was the kind of person who could be kept in the shape someone else designed for her. I'll be there, she said. She hung up. She stood in her mother's kitchen. She drank the coffee, which was cold by now, and she thought about everything that had happened in 11 days and everything that was still in motion and everything that was going to require her to be present and functional and capable for months and possibly years ahead. Then she called Grant. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which she'd learned meant he was always awake by 6 and was always doing something that required both hands and was managing the phone one-handed. She could hear it, the specific quality of ambient sound that meant a garage or a shop. Confirmed, she said. A pause. The ambient sound stopped. Confirmed, he said. Naomi called. Definitive match. She looked at the photograph on the kitchen table. She'd made a copy and framed the original, and the copy lived on the table where she could see it without being careful about it. I need to ask you something. Ask the motorcycle. Aaron's, the one from the garage. What about it? I want to restore it. Not to what it looked like when it was made, to what it looked like when he left it. Every modification, every scratch, every hour of work he put into it. I want it to be what it was. And I want him to be there when the engine starts. She heard Grant breathe. A long breath, the kind that carries weight on the way out. Yeah, he said. We can do that. I don't know how long it takes. I don't know what it costs. I know I have the resources now to Haley. His voice was patient. We've been looking at that bike for 20 years. Half the guys in the chapter could rebuild it blindfolded. You're not paying for labor. What you're doing is giving us a reason. He paused. That's worth more. She closed her eyes for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Thank Aaron for hiding it somewhere we'd eventually find it. She almost laughed. She almost did. The bail hearing was a Tuesday. Haley wore her mother's jacket, a dark green canvas field jacket that Rebecca had owned for 30 years and that smelled, faintly still, of something that Haley couldn't name, but that she associated with safety. She sat in the third row of the gallery. Naomi was at the table. The federal attorney was a woman named Sharon Park, who had the particular economy of motion of someone who had been in this room many times and found nothing about it impressive or intimidating. Calvin Rusk entered from the side door in a suit that had clearly been delivered to him specifically for this occasion, because the creases were too sharp for something that had been packed, and his attorney was a man whose hourly rate Grant had estimated, without particular interest, at something astronomical. Calvin looked at the gallery the way powerful people look at gallery scanning, evaluating, not expecting to be surprised. He saw Haley. He stopped scanning. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not look down. She sat with her mother's jacket on her shoulders and her father's compass around her neck, and she looked at the man who had taken 20 years from her family, and she did not move a muscle of her face. Calvin's attorney touched his arm. He looked away. The hearing took 45 minutes. Bail was set at a number that Sharon Park described afterward as appropriately uncomfortable. The conditions included surrender of passport and restriction of travel. Calvin's attorney argued each point with the elegant, expensive futility of a man who understood that the mathematics the C1s decided had already been and was simply performing the ritual that his client was paying him to perform. When it was over, when Calvin was being walked out, he passed the gallery. He stopped. His attorney said, "Quietly, Calvin." Calvin looked at Haley. She thought he might say something. Something that would try to reestablish whatever control was still available to him in whatever remained of their relationship. She braced for it. He said nothing. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the compass. Then he walked out the door. Naomi appeared at Haley's elbow. "You all right?" "Yes," Haley said. "That was well done. I didn't do anything. I just sat here." "That's what was required," Naomi said. "Sometimes that's everything." The restoration of Aaron's motorcycle took 9 weeks. Grant ran it as a chapter project, which in practical terms meant that on any given weekend, the garage attached to the Blue Ridge Roadhouse had between 6 and 20 men in it, working in shifts, doing the kind of focused, expert, unhurried work that comes from people who love a thing and know how to handle it. They sourced the original parts, some from suppliers, some from the chapter's collective inventory of decades of accumulated parts, some from a member named Ellis, who had been at a swap meet in Virginia in early October and called Grant from a stranger's driveway, having found exactly the right carburetor component after an hour of searching. Ellis drove back immediately. He said it felt important. Haley was there most weekends. Not to help with the mechanical work, she was honest. About not knowing enough to be useful but to be present, because presence was something she had learned was its own form of contribution. She sat on a stool in the corner of the garage and watched and asked questions when she had them and was quiet when she didn't. And the men who'd been writing with this chapter for 30 years found themselves explaining things they'd never had occasion to explain, breaking down the logic of machines for a 20-year-old who listened like understanding it mattered to her. It did matter to her. The bike was her father's language. She was learning to read it. Aaron came twice. The first time was 5 weeks into the restoration, on a Saturday when he had a good day, and Margaret Oakes drove him down herself 3 hours each way, which was an act of care so straightforward and complete that Haley struggled to find adequate words for it when she tried to thank Margaret later. Aaron stood in front of the bike for a long time, not moving, just looking. The men in the garage gave him space, not formally, not with any announced intention. They just moved to the edges of the room and found things to do on the periphery. Creating space at the center, The way men who have spent decades reading rooms do instinctively when the room requires a particular kind of quiet. Aaron reached out and put his hand on the fuel tank, the compass symbol, his emblem. He ran his thumb over it. Grant was watching from near the door. He had been watching Aaron's face since he came in. He had been watching for the thing that had been there in the garden, the resonance, the frequency response of a body, remembering what a mind has lost, and he could see it working, slowly, through Aaron's expression. Not flooding back. Not a movie version recovery. Not the dramatic unlocking of everything in a single transforming moment. Just accumulation. One specific memory at a time, each one small, each one real. "The seat's wrong," Aaron said. Everyone in the garage looked up. Aaron was still looking at the tank. He turned slightly toward Grant. "The seat. When I had it, the rear mounting bracket was slightly off-center. I was going to fix it before." He stopped. "I ran out of time. But I remember how it sat. It sat about a quarter-inch low on the left side when you were on it." One of the men near the bike, a mechanic named Horace, 60 years old, meticulous, crouched down and looked. Stood back up. "He's right," Horace said. Grant looked at Aaron. Aaron was almost smiling. The specific, quiet expression of a man who has been told, by something other than words, that he is still the person he thought he was. "I know this bike," he said. Not triumphantly, just as fact. As simple and solid as the machine itself. "Yeah," Grant said. "You do." The second visit was the week before the anniversary. Aaron had been in his first week of outpatient transition. Margaret had arranged a structured, supported process, and he was staying temporarily at a facility in Asheville so that the transition from full-time residential care was managed carefully and with appropriate backup available. He was sleeping in his first non-institutional bed in 20 years. He told Haley over the phone that he kept waking up in the night because the quiet was different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. He was learning the difference between his own quiet and someone else's managed quiet. He came to the garage on a Tuesday evening. Haley was already there. She'd been there since 5, doing the things she did sitting on the stool, being present. Aaron stood in the door for a moment. The bike was finished. Horace had completed the final work 3 days earlier, and they'd all agreed to leave it, for when Aaron came, not to start it without him. Aaron walked in. He walked around it once, slowly, the full circle, reading every inch of it. Nobody rushed him. Nobody said anything. The garage was quieter than any garage Haley had ever been in. It had that particular held quality of a room full of people collectively waiting for something and collectively committed to not making the waiting harder. Aaron stopped at the left side. He crouched down. He looked at the rear bracket, at the specific, precise quarter-inch correction that Horace had made based on his comment 5 weeks ago. He stood back up. He put both hands on the tank. "Start her up," he said. Grant crossed the garage. He sat on the bike. He had ridden Aaron's motorcycle once, 20 years ago, when they were testing the engine after a rebuild, and he had never forgotten how it felt under him, the specific personality of a machine that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and cared about the result. He kicked it. The engine turned, caught, held. The sound was not loud in the way that movie motorcycles are loud. It was present. It was the specific harmonic of a well-built shovelhead, a living sound, a sound with rhythm and character and history in it. It filled the garage not by volume, but by completeness. Like a voice coming back to a room it had been absent from too long. Aaron closed his eyes. The expression on his face was the most honest thing Haley had ever seen on a human being. Completely unguarded. 20 years of a man waiting for something he didn't have words for, and the something arriving in sound. And every wall that circumstance and injury and time had built around him going briefly. Entirely transparent. Haley had not planned to cry. She had spent the last 3 months being steadier than she had any right to expect of herself, managing each day's specific demands without letting the accumulation of them break her stride. She had cried in private, in her mother's house, in the specific hours of early morning that are honest in ways that afternoon and evening aren't, and she had kept the rest of herself functional and forward-facing. because there was always something that needed to be done. She cried now, quietly without performance, the way people cry when they have finally arrived somewhere they have been moving toward for a long time, and the arriving is too real and too large to simply experience without it coming through the body somehow. Grant cut the engine after a minute. Aaron opened his eyes. He looked at Haley. "Come here," he said. She crossed the garage. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she stood next to her father, and neither of them said anything, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was 20 years of letters and compasses, and hidden tubes and county roads, and a parking lot and a garden, and a DNA test, and a bail hearing, and 9 weeks of restoration, all arriving at this specific moment of standing next to each other in a garage. And it was imperfect and incomplete and real. It was real. The anniversary arrived on a September morning that had the same quality of light as the one a year before, the same clarity, the same edge of cool air, the same mountains, holding their position on the horizon the way mountains do, patient and unchanged. The Blue Ridge Roadhouse parking lot filled slowly, then all at once. The same lot, the same formation. 150 bikes, engines warming, the collective low rumble of them, vibrating through the asphalt. The same people largely, plus some, who had heard the story in the months between and had asked to be part of this one. Grant stood near the front and watched it fill. He thought about the year, about what a single morning could set in motion, about the specific chain reaction of one girl's courage running through a parking lot with no shoes and a photograph, and the absolute conviction that the truth was worth the cost and what it had unlocked, person by person, document by document, decision by decision, until 20 years of a carefully constructed lie had come apart along every seam simultaneously. Calvin Rusk's trial date was set for February. The federal charges had expanded to 14 counts in the months since the filing, as investigators following the thread Aaron's ledgers had provided found more fabric to pull. 2 of the men whose names appeared in the documents had entered into cooperation agreements. The case, as Sharon Park had told Naomi in a brief, professionally warm update, was solid in the way that cases are solid when the evidence has been preserved for 20 years inside a motorcycle engine by a man who had the foresight to understand that some things need to outlast the moment that created them. Haley came through the gap between 2 trucks. She was not running this time. She was walking, and she was walking beside Aaron. And Aaron was walking with a cane that he'd been using for 3 months, the balance issue old injury, it responded well to therapy, but not completely. And he had made peace with the cane in the specific way that people make peace with things that are simply true. And they were walking at Aaron's pace, which was unhurried, which was always how he had moved through things that mattered. Haley was in her mother's green jacket. Aaron was in a leather jacket that the chapter had given him 6 weeks ago. A gift that had been presented without ceremony or speech, because that was how gifts meant the most, just placed in his hands. Just there, just his. On the back of Aaron's jacket, above the chapter patch, someone had added his road name in careful, permanent script, North, because it was the only word he'd remembered, because it was what the compass always pointed, because it was what the people who knew him best understood about him, that he was the kind of man who oriented other people, who provided direction, who held his position in the dark so that the people who needed to find their way had something to find their way toward. Grant walked to meet them at the edge of the lot. He shook Aaron's hand, held it for a moment. 20 years compressed into a handshake, which was insufficient and also exactly right. He looked at Haley. "You ready?" he said. She looked at the 150 bikes. She looked at the mountains. She looked at her father, standing next to her on a September morning in Asheville, North Carolina, wearing a jacket with his name on it and holding the cane in his left hand and the compass in his right. "I've been ready," she said. They had fitted the sidecar to Aaron's own bike. For the day, Aaron could not yet ride it independently. The balance wasn't there, but he could sit beside it. He could feel the engine. He could be part of the machine he'd built in a different life, and that had waited for him while he was lost, and that had carried his daughter's inheritance inside its chassis for 20 years and had not. given it up to anyone but the person it was meant for. Haley would ride. She'd gotten her license in August. Grant had taught her, or rather had overseen the teaching, which the chapter had collectively treated as a matter of some significance, and had shown up for in numbers that had made the instructor at the licensing course pause and look out the window several times. She was not yet fast. She was careful and precise, and she had the specific quality of attention that good riders develop, which is the understanding that the machine responds to honesty. Aaron lowered himself into the sidecar. He arranged the cane. He settled. He looked at the bike around him, his bike, the one his hands had built, and he ran his fingers along the tank one time. Still about 60 hours of finish work left on the engine, he said. Haley swung her leg over, settled. I know, she said. We'll get to it. It's not urgent, he said. It'll wait. Some things do, she said. He looked at her. His daughter, 20 years old, 20 years absent from his life, sitting on his motorcycle on a September morning, with her mother's eyes and his stubbornness and a compass around her neck that had spent 20 years pointing at a truth nobody had been willing to look for until she had decided she was willing. Some things do, he agreed. Grant was at the front of the formation. He looked back along the line, 150 people, engines warming, the mountain air carrying the sound of all of them forward and back along the road. He looked at Aaron and Haley at the front. He looked at the clear September morning. He put on his helmet. He thought about the first memorial ride for Aaron Vale, 20 years ago. The specific weight of that morning, the grief without resolution, the anger without target, the love without anywhere to go. He had led that ride. He had led every memorial ride since. He had led them with the conviction that honoring a person meant keeping the truth of them alive in the people who remembered, even when the truth was incomplete, even when what you were working with was the shape of someone rather than the someone themselves. He had not expected, in 20 years of memorial rides, to one day have Aaron Vale at the front of his own. He started his engine. The signal moved back through the formation, one engine, then another, the rolling thunder of sequential startups that turned one sound into a collective one, building from front to back until the whole parking lot and the road beyond it, and possibly the mountains themselves, were full of the sound of 150 people in motion. Haley felt the sidecar engine come up through the frame beneath her. Aaron put his hand flat on the tank, not holding it, not gripping, just in contact, just present. She pulled out first. The route was the same route they had ridden every year for 20 years. The same mountain roads, the same elevation changes, the same turns that the chapter's institutional memory had preserved as faithfully as any other kind. It was the route Aaron had loved. It was the route that his friends had ridden in his name while he was lost and unavailable and alive without knowing it. Today he led it. The mountain morning came at them as it always did the air. The light, the specific quality of motion that roads like these produce, the sense of moving through something larger than yourself, something that was here before you and will be here after, and the particular clarifying truth of being a small thing on a large road and finding that smallness liberating rather than diminishing. Haley rode. The compass was against her chest. Her father's hand was on the tank of his own bike. The road was ahead of them, and the mountains were around them, and the sound of 150 engines made the September morning enormous and real and full of everything they had carried to get here. At the first long curve, where the road rose slightly and opened a view that Haley had been told was Aaron's favorite point of the route, she heard her father's voice beside her, low and certain, directed at the road and the morning, and no one in particular. There it is, he said. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. She had followed a compass through the dark for 20 years without knowing it was a compass. And now she was here, and the road was long behind them and longer ahead. And not 1 mile of it, not a single mile of the long, terrible, redemptive, improbable distance between Rebecca Monroe's kitchen window and this mountain curve on a September morning had been wasted. Some truths take 20 years to arrive. They arrive anyway. And the people who were brave enough to keep the door open, who hid them inside machines, who pressed them into the bottom of jewelry boxes, who ran across parking lots with no shoes and an old photograph, and the absolute refusal to accept that a lie gets to be permanent, simply because it has been sustained for a long time. Those people are the reason that truth has somewhere to come home to. Haley Monroe rode her father's motorcycle into the September morning, and the road opened ahead of them, and the compass pointed north, and they followed it. That is what family is. Not the name on a document, or the signature on a form, or the oratory of a man who confuses possession with love. Family is the truth you preserve for someone you haven't met yet. It is the compass you leave. It is the door you keep unlocked. It is the person who comes running 20 years later and finds it exactly where you left it because you knew them well enough before they existed to know they would come.